So my presentation, and I'll try to be brief as I can since I'm between you and lunch at this point, is to talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage opportunities. I've got a little bit of a setup there in that. In the last talk, talking about that being a critical technology, but one that's not moving forward as quickly as it needs to. And I'll give you some of the reasons why, and I'll talk about some of the really interesting things going on in CCUS that I think are very encouraging. This slide and the next one are two that I can be fairly brief on because they're points that have been hammered on a number of times already today. The first being here, what is global energy use projected to do over the coming decades, and you see the rather dramatic growth in global energy use. And in particular, you see within this projection, these were actually based on the Copenhagen commitments, and so the Paris agreements would be more aggressive in lowering carbon emissions. But even with the Copenhagen agreements, you can see we remain dominated by fossil fuels going out to 2050 and beyond. We've also alluded earlier in the day to the fact that the growth in energy use will come in the developing world. Here I show the use in the developed countries being flat to slightly decreasing, and use in the other G20 countries and the rest of the world growing rather dramatically. In all cases dominated by fossil fuels. So let me just say a few words about the challenge here with CO2 emissions. Partly to remind you that the challenge here is not to get carbon out of the energy system, it's to get carbon emissions out of the energy system. And I think a lot of people lose sight of the goal in their interest of particular tactics. But ultimately, we need to get energy to the consumers around the world, and we need to do it in a way that respects the climate. And that involves getting rid of CO2 emissions as quickly as we can do it. So what's the challenge there? The challenge there is that emissions of CO2 are now about 40 billion tons per year. And those are coming primarily from fossil fuels use, which has been accelerating. That emissions of CO2 gets divided or partitioned among three major uptakes. One of those is plants and soils on Earth. That's about 30%. Another 26% ends up in the ocean. And the remainder goes into the atmosphere. And that's, of course, those are the numbers we hear in parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, it's not necessarily good for the oceans that they're taking up a large part of these CO2 emissions either. We see problems with acidification of the ocean. So we need to get roughly 40 billion tons per year, ultimately, of CO2 emissions out of the energy sector. And I think CCUS can be a big contributor to that. To look at the breakdown of this 40 gigatons per year of CO2 emissions, China and India, using mainly coal, are growing fast. There are signs that China's coal use is beginning to slacken off. The growth is slacking because of the economic downturn in China. In the U.S., we emit about 5 gigatons per year of CO2. That's about 1/8 of the global emissions. And of course, the U.S. looks much worse when you put all these on a per capita basis. The U.S. emits about 8 times as much CO2 per capita as India. In the U.S., if you look at what each of us does individually, that's about 16 tons per person per year. And if you put that at reservoir temperature and pressure, that's about 27 cubic meters per person per year. of CO2 to put in the ground. So that's to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge here. Now, Robert Percolating, a number of years back, posited the idea that if you're going to get all of this CO2 emissions out of the system, you don't need to try to do it. You probably can't successfully do it by all from one technique. So he suggested the idea of wedges or a variety of techniques to reduce the CO2 emissions in the energy system. So techniques like, as we've already heard about, energy efficiency. If we can be more efficient in the combustion to make power, then we can lower emissions while still providing the same amount of power. Renewables, we've heard about renewables already today. Renewables provide a route to lowering CO2 emissions, but some of the leading renewable technologies, solar and wind in particular, have the downside of intermittency, and we need technologies to firm up that electricity production around the clock and from season to season. Perhaps coal or gas ultimately with CCUS could be a technology to do that. As you know, we work a lot on storage today, and we have some pretty good ideas for day-night storage for solar. Nobody has a really good idea yet for seasonal storage of solar energy, but fossil fuels with carbon capture could do that. And of course, among the candidates for wedges to get large amounts of CO2 out of the energy system, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, I think is a crucial one. So what are the problems you got to solve to make this work, to make this be a contributor? First, as was just alluded in the previous talk, capture is expensive. In terms of energy penalty on the system, the combustion system or the power production system, it's about a 30 to 60% energy penalty. That's a very expensive penalty. So we need improvements in the capture technology. If we could figure out a way to profitably utilize some of that CO2, to monetize it, that would help provide incentive for capture and help underwrite the cost of the capture. One large-scale utilization of captured CO2 in practice today is EOR. That's used pretty widely around the world. But we're not yet at scale with other technologies for utilizing captured CO2. Second, meaningful quantities of CO2 that we need to deal with are huge, and they're comparable to hydrocarbon use in today's system. If we were going to have one of these Percolating wedges with CCUS, say 1/8 of the CO2 emissions, that would be 5 gigatons per year, so 1/8 of that 40 gigatons per year. That's equivalent to 40 gigabarrels of CO2 for injection in the ground. Keep in mind that global oil production today is about 34 gigabarrels per year. So it's the same order of magnitude of CO2 to sequester or use as we produce oil today. Another comparison, wastewater injection today is about 100 gigabarrels per year. Third issue, unless an aquifer for storage is near the production site, then you'll need transport. You need a pipeline of some sort. And as you can see from the numbers above, the amount of CO2 you have to transport is significant. Storage is challenging. So as you put it in the ground, you have large quantities of CO2 that you're going to have to permanently isolate in pore space. You're going to have to do pressure management as you inject in order to minimize or limit induced seismicity or earthquakes at injection sites. And then lastly, you have to be able to monitor and verify that the CO2 is where you say it is over very long periods of time. The good news is that solution to these problems could easily be applied globally, and so there's great opportunity for developing solutions and sharing around the world. What I'm going to do now is go very quickly over a couple of examples of ideas that are percolating in the innovation laboratories at MIT. I'm sure there's work like this going on around the world that have the potential to change the game for CCUS. This first picture is a look at how I might redo the capture technology so as to dramatically reduce the energy penalty for capture. What I'm going to do is compare in the top half of this picture today's amine capture technologies, in which an amine is used to absorb CO2 to bond with CO2. And then I have to get the amine bound to the CO2 to let go of the CO2. The way you do that in commercial practice is to use a thermal desorber. So you heat up the amine solution to the point where the CO2 no longer binds and it's let go. The problem with that is that you have to use a lot of the steam from the plant in order to heat the thermal desorption unit. That requires expensive replumbing of the steam lines. It also sucks away a lot of the steam that could otherwise be used for power production. An alternative technology is shown at the bottom where you use an electrochemically mediated capture and release technology. It's based on an amine technology, but you add a metal ion, which in the desorption half of the process binds more tightly to the amine than the CO2. Right? So it's like your dog has a stick in his mouth and you offer a treat. So the dog drops the stick and grabs the food, right? And so you can get the CO2 back. That can be done at very low energy penalty. So you can get a savings of about 40% relative to traditional amine capture. Lots of new ideas percolating on solid adsorbents for CO2 capture. We've historically lived, as I said, down in the amine capture area. But if you look on the upper right, you can see solid adsorbents that can hold a lot of CO2 per gram of adsorbent, but require high temperatures to release, which is not favorable. New work is in the upper left part of this curve, which uses some new zeolite materials and metal organic frameworks to achieve high capture of CO2 with low temperatures for desorption. These metal organic frameworks are particularly interesting because the chemistry to make them allows a lot of control over the detailed structure of the pores and the chemistry in the system, so that I have extraordinarily high surface area. If you look at 1 gram of some of these metal organic frameworks, bottom left, so this 1 gram in a little beaker is compared with a penny, that has an area of 5,000 square meters onto which you can adsorb nitrogen or CO2 in practice. That's the equivalent of this football field shown at the bottom right. So enormous amounts of area per unit of weight of these new adsorbents. So that's got a lot of potential. A lot of interesting work in labs around the world going on looking at nanostructured catalyst that can do CO2 electroreduction or can allow doing reverse water gas shift reactions. If you look on the left hand column here, you can see that there's a whole variety of different catalysts that can be used on the electrodes to produce products ranging from hydrocarbons to carbon monoxide to carboxyl to hydrogen. So lots of different products that I could go to in a CO2 utilization activity. One of the goals in this nanostructured catalyst research is to be able to reduce or eliminate platinum group metal use, very expensive part of these catalyst, and a piece that would inhibit scaling of the technology to global scales. One way to reduce the amount of these platinum group metals is to use core shell architectures in the catalyst. So for example, here's a series of nanoparticle catalysts that have a coating of one type of catalyst. Let's take the far left for an example. So a gold coating on top of a transition metal carbide interior structure. And I can choose the transition metal carbide to have particular affinities for either carbonaceous species or oxygen species, which allows me to do selective adsorption. Tungsten carbide, for example, has a preferential affinity for oxygen, doesn't like carbon at all. Whereas I can keep the electronic properties of the gold outer layer for catalysis purposes. So being able to do these nanostructured designs of catalyst offers the potential for game-changing production of new products from CO2 streams. There are also interesting technologies for electrochemical reduction of CO2, which might be combined with the new capture strategy that I showed earlier as an alternative to amine capture, and that's illustrated here. Last piece of the puzzle is the storage piece, and as I mentioned, that's a very daunting part of the challenge because of the very large amounts of CO2 involved, but it's also one that we're starting to get our hands around much better. Two constraints that we have to keep in mind in injecting CO2. One is the footprint of the migrating CO2 plume, and that has to stay inside of the basin. And the second is that the pressure that we use for injection mustn't fracture the rock, right? If I fracture the cap rock in particular, then I can get leaks of the CO2. That's in fact what stopped CO2 sequestration in the Insala field demonstration. For doing capacity measurements, we can use fluid mechanics, look at capillary trapping mechanisms, for example. We find that the storage capacity is a dynamic quantity, that for small injection times, it's overpressure that's limiting. That is, what pressure do I have to exert at the well in order to get CO2 to move into the formation? That pressure can't be so large as to fracture the rock or induce seismic activity. Lastly, for long injection times, it's migration that's limiting. And so you get a profile shown at the bottom left, which is the true capacity of the system. You can see it's dominated by pressure limitations at short times and by migration at long times. So my brief summary or conclusion here is that CCUS has a lot of potential to be a key component in carbon mitigation portfolios, and in particular allowing us to use energy resources that we're very accustomed to and know how to deal with on a global scale today. Most studies show that it can contribute between 15 and 20% to the solution we need for CO2 emissions reduction. All the components of CCUS systems are in commercial use today, and so it's a matter of learning how to lower costs of those systems and how to add variety to the technologies we have in our toolkit. We do have yet to address issues related to integration, cost reduction, and increasing scale of operation going forward. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll get out of the way for lunch.